Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. I imagine that almost everyone was here last time or saw this on Zoom and so forth, so we don't need a second round of introduction to make my mother proud. This is the second of my lectures sort of reporting on what I've done since I retired. And tonight I'm going to talk about, I'll show you in a minute, another book that came up as a result of reacting to somebody else's publications. I'm going to mention a lot of numbers tonight, mostly by way of showing you how historians can figure tricky things out. Please don't be daunted by all the figures. The important thing is not the specific numbers, which you don't have to remember. Just look for the pattern, okay? Raoul Hilberg's path-breaking essay entitled German Railroads, Jewish Souls, which appeared in 1976 and directed scholars' attention to the role of the Reichsbahn, the German National Railroad, in the murder of the European Jews, has largely stood the test of time. More detailed studies have added depth to our knowledge, but have not substantially altered his description of the scheduling, financing, and operation of the deportation trains. Neither have subsequent researchers questioned the main point Hilberg emphasized. The managers of the Reichsbahn exhibited what he regarded as the central trait of modern bureaucracies: their treatment of means as ends, of performance as purpose, of fulfilling functions as the highest obligation. Knowing, or being easily able to find out, what they were enabling when they smoothly integrated the transportation of Jews to the East into routine operations, most railway executives gave scarcely a thought to the murders, because they were somebody else's responsibility. As Hilberg wrote, normal procedures were employed as if extreme decisions were not being made. Because Hilberg's essay powerfully conveys these fundamental insights, Christopher Browning and I republished it in 2020 in a book of essays and documents on deportations that we assembled. I considered Raoul a friend, and at his wife's invitation, I spoke at his memorial service in 2007. But he was not infallible. The chief findings of his essay include three tangential observations that went beyond what his evidence warranted, yet they have exerted continuing influence on the field. And I got to digress to explain why I think Raoul did this. Anybody who ever saw Raoul Hilberg talk knows that he was at heart a preacher, and he cherished the impactful phrase. And I think this was one of the cases where, in his desire to hold people's attention, he just went a little too far. He asserted that deportation trains rolled continuously throughout the Holocaust, that they had, quote, some priority on European railroads, and that, quote, from October 1941 to October 1944, no Jew was left alive for lack of transport, unquote. I think most people to this day reflexively believe that these statements reflect reality. But the first statement, throughout this time, makes no allowance for numerous and considerable ebbs and flows of deportation traffic, even in the peak year of 1942, and especially thereafter. The second and third statements, recent research shows, were simply untrue. Hilberg's suppositions reflect an almost universal tendency in the early decades of Holocaust scholarship to overestimate the number and frequency of deportation trains, the amount of equipment they required, and the resulting deleterious effects on the German war effort. Despite now more than 3 decades of clarifying research, much of it by German scholars, some historians still cling to widespread misconceptions about these matters. Although several of the newest survey histories of the Holocaust take pains to correct the record, their effect remains to be seen. My remarks tonight are an effort to demonstrate what historians have learned about deportations of Jews by rail since Hilberg presented his pioneering essay. Scholars' persistent misunderstandings about the deportation of Jews during the Holocaust result primarily from the mesmerizing effect of the enormity of the death toll. Many historians reflexively suppose that massive results required a corresponding level of inputs. To kill 6 million people, half or slightly more of them after shipment to death camps, must have entailed, so the presumption goes, enormous outlays of personnel, equipment, and expense. We now know that this was false in almost every relevant respect. The gases used, carbon monoxide and Zyklon, were cheap and in plentiful supply until after most of the killing had happened. In fact, one of the most macabre things I've ever done in my career is I had the figures for the receipts of the purchase of Zyklon for Auschwitz and Birkenau, and I had the tally of the number of people who were killed, and I worked it out. It comes out to 1 US penny per corpse from 1942 to 44. Most of the death camps were ramshackle and jerry-rigged, staffed by only 20 to 30 Germans, supported by 90 to 130 Eastern European auxiliaries, all of them more than paid for out of the booty taken from the victims. And I think I showed last week the images of, on the upper right, what you have there is the image of the Sobibor camp. The one in the middle is the ruin that is left from Chelmno. And the one you don't have on the left, which I'll show you in a minute. Even Auschwitz, eventually the biggest and most permanent killing site, depended initially on pilfered barbed wire, barter arrangements with IG Farben for crucial building materials, and refitting a powder magazine and 2 peasant houses as gas chambers. This is the image there is of Crematorium 1 at the main Auschwitz camp. This is the converted powder magazine. And incidentally, if any of you have recently seen the film about the Commandant Höss of Auschwitz, he was hanged just to the right of that picture at the end of the war. And even at peak strength late in the war, the Auschwitz camp's German garrison came to roughly the size of a single Wehrmacht regiment. Even the shooting units in the east represented little diversion from the front lines. As the Einsatzgruppen had only about 3,000 members, and the order police battalions would have been assigned to occupation duties in any case, and often consisted of people considered ineligible for the army. They were replaced increasingly from 1942 on by non-German collaborators in the units that were called Schutzmannschaften. One of the most alarming aspects of the Holocaust is that its execution not only required tiny fractions of the Third Reich's personnel and resources, but also occurred in large part before these became stretched. After all, 3/4 of the Jews murdered in the Holocaust died before the Germans' surrender at Stalingrad. That is, while the Germans were winning the war. By then, 9/10 of the Polish Jewish victims of the Nazi onslaught already were dead. 2 of the 6 death camps on pre-war Polish soil had ceased to operate. Their missions to liquidate the Jews in their respective vicinities were completed, and another 2 of the murder sites were winding down. So it was with the deportation trains. They made up a similarly small share of railroad traffic in the Nazi Empire, and most ran before equipment shortages became pressing. When Hilberg wrote his essay, neither the total number of trains used to deport Jews nor the share of German rolling stock they required was well understood. Professor Wolfgang Scheffler had compiled the best available estimate on the former subject only a few years earlier in preparation for an aborted prosecution of Albert Ganzenmüller, the veteran Nazi who became state secretary in the Reich Transportation Ministry in May of 1942. Incidentally, it was an abortive prosecution because the trial began in 1974. It was suspended in 1977 on grounds of Ganzenmüller's ill health, and he lived on to the age of 91 and died in 1996. Scheffler reckoned that 2,055 trains, carrying an average of 1,460 people each, had brought just over 3 million people to their deaths. The figures remained the general baseline of understanding for many years, because scholars of the Holocaust were understandably more concerned to find out how many people were deported from various locations over time than about how many trains and wagons moved them. Only in recent years have researchers tried to establish a comprehensive and reliable record of shipments to death camps. A pioneering effort of this sort was Alfred Gottwald and Diana Schuller's compilation of the transports carrying Jews that left the Greater German Reich. This is just Austria, Germany, the Protectorate of Bohemia, Moravia, Luxembourg, and the territory annexed from Poland between 1941 and 1945. This was published in 2005. The authors identified 414 transports of Jews to Theresienstadt and or out of the Reich between October 15th, 1941 and April 15th, 1945, a span of 42 months. But many of these transports, especially in 1943-44, carried very few Jews and consisted of only one or two cars attached to the rear of regularly scheduled trains. Specially assembled trains, Sonderzüge, for deportations had to carry at least approximately 400 Jews, the somewhat flexible threshold figure that triggered reduced fares per person, what the railroad charged the SS to move people. The number of these dedicated transports in Gottwald and Schuller's itemization is 216, 193 of which departed between October 15th, 1941 and April 19th, 1943. After that, there were only 23 more. The monthly average of significant departures is therefore almost 11 in the first 18-month period and fewer than 1 in the second period of 24 months. At about the same time as Gottwald and Schuller's book appeared, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem undertook to create a comprehensive and reliable online database of all deportations of Jews during the Holocaust. That project is now largely complete with regard to Germany, Austria, the Czech lands, the annexed part of Poland, and Western and Southern Europe, but not for the occupied but not annexed part of Poland, called the General Government, and portions of Ukraine. On the basis of Yad Vashem's findings and the other sources indicated, this is a table that I compiled. You'll see the country names on the screen. Where an asterisk follows the name, those are Yad Vashem's figures, that listing of the deportation trains that I have tabulated. Where there is no asterisk, I've had to rely on published works about the Holocaust in each of those places to put together at least a rough estimate of what the totals are. Now, on the basis of those findings and other sources, this table presents my estimate of the number of large-scale special Sonderzüge transports involved in deporting Jews to death from all of Nazi-controlled Europe except the General Government and the occupied Soviet Union in the period from the onset of deportations in 1941 to the termination of gassings at Auschwitz, the last operating death camp at the end of October 1944. Now, this is updated, incidentally, from the figures that if you do go find this book, this has been updated from that. Yad Vashem has made considerable progress about the deportations that I just said to you were incomplete from the general government and Ukraine. But the way the material is compiled on their website now is very hard to work with because it incorporates things that I listed here separately before. And I just couldn't figure it all out to update this completely for tonight. Now, my tabulation suggests that the deportations from most of Europe required 845 trains over that's the number in the lower right-hand corner, over 36 months, some 23 per month, or fewer than one per day. Of these, almost half, 48%, emanated from the Greater German Reich. The numbers also indicate that more than half of all transports rolled in 1942 at a rate of 36 per month, or more than one per day. But that in this period, the Greater German Reich was the point of origin for more than 3/5 of the departures, the rest of Europe generating only 13 per month, or one every 2 days. And 1942 marked the high point of deportations from both inside and outside Germany, aside from the cataclysmic assault on Hungarian Jews in 1944, which gives you the number goes up again in 1944 solely because of Hungary. Because 1942 marked the apex of the Holocaust, this table deploys the Yad Vashem findings, again indicated by an asterisk, as well as other sources, to present an overview of the number of transports operating at the apogee of the killing, including trains in the German-occupied East to death camps. For these figures, we have records that, so I'm showing you, these will include trains that are coming from within the general government, because this is categorized by destination rather than origin. The statistics indicate that 4 to 5 trains departed per day over most of Nazi-controlled Europe, while the murders were at their peak. Now that we have, so give you a minute to digest those numbers. Now that we have a semi-complete picture of the number of transports dedicated to the murder of Jews, we can begin to calculate what proportion of German railway rolling stock this traffic entailed. Special trains, Sonderzüge, devoted solely to deportations, varied considerably in length, both by place and date of origin. From Germany, including the annexed Polish city of Łódź, they usually consisted of 20 third or fourth class passenger cars for deportees, plus or minus 2 to 3 wagons for luggage and guards. From Western Europe and Slovakia, the total number of cars was generally similar, but the use of freight wagons for the deportees was the norm. These are 2 pictures you get. On the left, you see the image of the third class passenger wagons that were used from Germany proper. And on the right, I think that picture is actually of a transport being loaded in Łódź. That is the kind of rolling stock that was used there. By October 1942, the transports from Theresienstadt were becoming longer, including approximately 27 cars for deportees and 3 more for goods and guards. Late in the war, when the average number of deportees per transport more than doubled, more rolling stock was required. The trains from Hungary, however, were set at 45 freight wagons plus 1 car for guards, and at least one of the transports in March of 1943 from Salonika in Greece consisted of 48 wagons. On the other hand, the transports from Italy consisted of only 10 to 12 cars. In Poland and farther east, variation was enormous. The surviving records for 1942-43 show transports as small as 16 to 21 cargo cars for deportees, plus 1 for guards, to as large as 60 freight wagons, plus or minus 2 for guards, during the Great Deportation from Warsaw. In the summer of 1943, the final liquidations of the Lida and Minsk ghettos employed approximately 23 and 29 freight cars, respectively. Given all this variation, estimates of the equipment employed must be rough and calculated on the basis of averages. If one makes generous allowance and postulates that the average number of cars on each of the 651 trains from Western Europe, Greater Germany, and Slovakia works out to 25, and the corresponding figure for the 47 trains from Greece, Bulgaria, and Italy is 40, and then assumes that the Hungarian trains held to their planned strength of 45 wagons, the total number of passenger and freight wagons used on the 865 known large-scale transports of Jews from outside the general government and the occupied Soviet Union cannot have exceeded 25,000. Compare these figures, as well as Scheffler's estimate of 2,055 trains and just over 3 million deportees all told, to the numbers in this table concerning the carrying capacity of the German Reichsbahn as a whole in the period 1941 to 44. The total number of Jews transported to death, probably 2.5 million in 1942-43, is less than half of 1% of the more than 6.6 billion passengers the Reichsbahn carried in those years. Raise the number of victims to 3 million by the end of 1944, and estimate conservatively 2.5 billion Reichsbahn passengers that year, and the share of deported Jews drops to 1/3 of 1%. The total numbers of trains carrying Jews from outside of the general government and the occupied Soviet Union, 845, and Scheffler's estimate of 2,055 total deportation trains, represent infinitesimal fractions of the roughly 30 million trains at an average of 28,000 per day that ran during those 3 years. The 25,000 wagons used on all of the 845 documented trains over 3 years equals less than 17% of the average number of wagons loaded by the Reichsbahn every day in 1942 to 44, which is 149,000. Assume another 1,210 trains operated in the German East to add up to Scheffler's total, with an average of 40 wagons each, and the total additional wagons come to 48,000 plus, or 1/3 of that average daily loading figure. Add both sets of numbers together, 2,055 trains and 73,317 wagons, and the sums come to less than 10% of the number of trains operating daily in the Third Reich, and less than 50% of the number of wagons loaded daily in German rail yards. This is a moment where I have to tell a story that'll probably get me in trouble. One of the most salient facts about the Holocaust is we know how many people died. And that's the mesmerizing number I referred to. But we don't think very much about the total capacity of the system that took them away. I had a period of time at Northwestern when I was chair of the German department. Yeah. The language departments were a little jealous of each other. And one of my colleagues pointed out that the Slavic department ranked higher in its universe than the German department did nationally. And one of my more cynical colleagues said, you know how to have a top 10 Slavic department? Have one. Because there are only 25 in the country, whereas there might be, I don't know, 125 German departments. Numerator, denominator. That's the theme of this whole lecture. We know the numerator. We never think of what is the universe in which this data swims. And this is a subset of something I learned in teaching about the Holocaust. When I started teaching about it in first did the course in 1987, I realized that students came in knowing a good deal about World War II. they didn't know, or they knew a lot of erroneous things about the Holocaust. By the end, when I stopped teaching it in 2015, I observed the reverse. They came in knowing a lot about the Holocaust. They didn't know anything about World War II. In the old days, you couldn't see the Holocaust for the guns, the smoke of battle. And at the end, they couldn't see the battle through the smoke of the crematorium. That's the optic that developed. Well, this is a subset of that we think about the enormity of what happened, and we don't realize the enormity in which it took place. So these figures about what's the share of the whole are an illustration of that. We forget the enormity of the resources that the Germans had available, and those were dwarfed by the enormity of the resources that this country deployed in World War II. Another way of grasping how few of Germany's rail capacities became engaged in the Holocaust is to compare the number of transports of Jews to the number of trains involved in preparing major military operations. Even if Scheffler's total of 2,000 transports over 3 years turns out to be approximately correct, and the fragmentary statistics currently available suggest that the specially assembled trains to death camps from the general government and the occupied Soviet Union will add up to fewer than the 1,234 not presently accounted for in his totals. That figure scarcely stands comparison with the 16,000 trains and 185,000 wagons that deployed German troops and supplies to all fronts in August 1939 alone, 1 month. Or the 33,000 trains used in preparation for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The contextualization that these numbers provide leads inescapably to the conclusion that the deportation of the Jews did not represent a major challenge to the German railways or a significant drain on their resources during the apogee of death camp operations in 1942-43. More than 2 decades ago, Kurt Petzold and Erika Schwarz noted that even if 10 deportation trains were in transit simultaneously on any given day in 1942, they would have constituted 0.4% of the trains in motion. The authors concluded pointedly, quote, "None of the transportation problems that existed from the beginning to the end of the war were considerably or even appreciably worsened by the requirements of the SS to achieve the final solution, nor would they have been solved by the absence of those efforts," unquote. More recently, Christian Gerlach established that 37 deportation trains running in the German Reich in April 42 came to only slightly more than 1% of all the special trains created that month for various purposes. This includes things like outings of the Hitler Youth and so forth. And much less than that proportion of the regular traffic in operation. Such calculations are buttressed by an authoritative contemporary source. No less a figure than Albert Ganzenmüller told a conference at the propaganda ministry in Berlin on July 14th, 1942, that the Reich was not short of rolling stock for its needs. In fact, he had 1.1 million freight wagons at his disposal, including those obtained from occupied countries, 140,000 of which rolled every day between Germany and the occupied East, and 30,000 of which stood idle every day for lack of cargo. The quantity of equipment required for deportations was even less significant than these numbers imply, because the German railroad bureaucracy found several ways to contain the call on its resources. First, as Heiner Lichtenstein demonstrated more than 30 years ago, the Reichsbahn scrimped on the equipment allocated for deportations. It often consisted of, quote, "otherwise scarcely still usable cargo wagons, including wagons that had been taken out of service," the German is ausrangiert waren, but then made operational again. Non-watertight cargo cars were fine for Jews and gypsies. So were worn-out locomotives with much reduced speed, because no fixed timetable had to be kept. In this way, the railroad secured revenues with trains and locomotives that otherwise had value only as scrap. The railroad supplied cattle cars, indeed often old and rotted ones, in which cattle or horses for the troops could no longer be transported, unquote. Even the passenger cars, you saw the image earlier, that the Reichsbahn deployed for German Jews were of similar quality. Jeanette Wolff described those that carried her from Dortmund to Riga in January 1942 as, quote, decommissioned, ausrangiert, totally filthy fourth-class wagons that could not have been used even one more time for transporting troops, unquote. Not least because they were unheated and their toilets disgustingly full and frozen. Second, especially on recurrent routes such as Warsaw to Treblinka, the Reichsbahn set aside a limited, dedicated number of locomotives and cars so that one or more trains could shuttle back and forth repeatedly. Already in early 1942, a single train traveling from the Galicia district, so this is southern Poland, across southern Poland, to Belchec and back, sufficed to deport 200,000 people, one train. A conference at Eichmann's headquarters in Berlin in late September 1942 noted that 5 trains would soon run per day from various parts of Poland to Treblinka or Belchec and back, each using cargo wagons that already had been allocated by the Railroad Directorate in Krakow. Another gathering at the Railroad Management Office for the East in Berlin on January 1st, 1943, laid out the timetable for several, quote, trains to be used multiple times, unquote, between Theresienstadt or Bialystok and Auschwitz or Treblinka. 2 circulating trains, one to Belchec and one to Sobibor, were all the Reich needed to empty the Izbica transit ghetto in late 1942. Because the Nazi regime staggered deportations in the general government, you all remember that illuminated map from last time with the dots and so forth, show you how they went from one little village to the camp and then back to another little village. Okay. Because the Nazi regime staggered deportations in the general government, concentrating on different large ghettos in succession and phasing roundups in the small towns and countryside from district to district like a rolling barrage of artillery, the persecution machinery was able to reuse the same equipment over and over. Moreover, this procedure had the added benefit of assuring that rail lines would not get congested. Even the route, and here, this is I'm going to have a little problem maybe, because, there we go. This line that you see there, that is the railroad line that runs from Warsaw up to Białystok and then on to the siege of Leningrad. The deportations from Warsaw went up here. At that spot, at that junction, they turned off onto this siding, and that took them down to Treblinka. So the last part of it was removing from the main railway line that supplied the siege of Leningrad and the German front in the northwest of Russia. The average number per day during the murderous latter half of 1942 on that main line of average number of deportation trains was only 3, which was 4% of the line's daily carrying capacity of 72 trains in that direction. And therefore, it was no impediment to the 30 or 40 trains that each day supplied Army Group Center via that route. Still, a third way of making sure that deportations did not drain the Reichsbahn's resources or clog its lines was through capitalizing on the return routes of otherwise necessary traffic. In 1942, 15 to 18 trains per day, each composed of 27 boxcars and 1 passenger car for escort, brought rounded up forced laborers from the occupied East to Germany. These provided more than enough material to fill out the 1 to 2 transports of Jews per day that left the Reich daily. These Russian trains, or worker transports, I'm quoting now, which are supposed to roll back empty into the general government, unquote, constituted the only equipment that the Reichsbahn made available to Eichmann in March 1942, but were thoroughly sufficient for his purpose. Conversely, in November of that year, the Germans planned to add 3 trains per week to deport Jews from the Lublin and Radom districts of the general government to Belchec and Sobibor. What were they going to use for wagons? The wagons that had brought in the Polish potato harvest to Germany and now became available for rolling back. In 1943, the trains that carried Greek Jews to death had supplied German occupation forces and lacked any other return cargo. That the deportation of Jews depended on such expedients and workarounds reflected a fundamental fact. Neither Adolf Eichmann nor his counterpart for deportations from within the general government, whose name was Hans Höfler, and not even Heinrich Himmler, had the power to demand or commandeer railway equipment. They did not for a simple reason. The Holocaust did not have priority in the allocation of locomotives and wagons over other dimensions of the German war effort. Just as the trains used to deport Jews did not have priority over other traffic on the railways controlled by the Reich. At both the policy and the operational level, the deportation of Jews always was subordinate to other more pressing needs. That is why crowded and dilapidated freight cars carrying Jews repeatedly spent long hours shunted onto sidings while more important transports passed before resuming their slow chugs toward death camps behind overtaxed and second-rate locomotives. That's also why these trains got no better equipment. Military considerations frequently impeded the flow of deportees, but the reverse happened seldom, if ever. Consider the following examples. Eichmann's initial transports of Jews to the Nisko reservation in southern Poland in late 1939 came to an abrupt end when the German High Command said that moving Polish prisoners of war and several German divisions in the opposite direction were more important. Christian Gerlach has identified 4 other instances of military considerations prevailing over and blocking deportations of Jews. One is the termination of shipments from Germany to Minsk in November 1941 during the March on Moscow. The second is the suspension of deportations in annexed and occupied Poland in the second half of June and the first half of September 1942 during the advance towards Stalingrad. The third is the suspension of all deportation trains in the general government from mid-December 1942 to mid-January 1943 during the siege of Stalingrad, and a longer interruption of transports from France at the turn of 1942-43, in part in order to reserve equipment for the movement of troops home on furlough for Christmas and then back to their billets. In a related vein, Yitzhak Arad has noted that the gas chambers at Belchec and Sobibor did not operate at full capacity during the initial rounds of deportations from Polish ghettos in March to July of 1942, because the offensive in the southern USSR siphoned off the rolling stock. David Cesarani maintains rightly that, quote, no military action was ever suspended to ensure that the shipment of Jews to the gas chambers continued without interruption, unquote. But even by less stringent standards of measurement, the Holocaust did not undercut the German war effort, mostly because it was not allowed to do so. The sort of high-quality railway equipment needed to move effective fighting forces, that is, air and watertight heated wagons for troops, flatbeds and other specialized cars to move artillery, armor, and fuel, and new streamlined war locomotives and other types adapted to operating conditions in different war zones. That kind of equipment was never used to transport Jews. Moreover, as that list of examples I just read to you shows, One of the most compelling examples of military considerations overriding deportation actions when clashes arose concerns events that are often cited to prove the contrary. After ranking German officers on the Eastern Front in late 1941 objected to the use of trains, and we're going to need to resort to a map here, and I'm going to need my glasses to show you the map. All right. Late 1941, after ranking German officers on the Eastern Front objected to the use of trains to deport Jews to Minsk, while soldiers on the fighting line were not receiving adequate supplies of food and ammunition, the deportations stopped, even though the connection between them and the supply bottlenecks was tenuous at best. Now here, that's Minsk, right in the middle of the circle. You see here, you have a black line. That is the sort of outer reaches of the first phase of the German invasion. And then and we're talking now about late 1941. This is a map in the middle of 42. So the German front in late 41 already reached Leningrad, already reached Moscow. It had not gone this down here that far. That was in 1942. So notice here, here's Minsk. The front line is all the way up here. The problem was not getting supplies to Minsk, which is where the deportations of Jews were going. Plenty of trains were getting to both Minsk, there, and Riga, up here. The problem was, east of those cities, there were very few rail lines. And this is what led, to the failure of supplies to get to the front. The catch was that very few supply trains were getting farther than Minsk and Riga because relatively few rail lines ran north and east from these cities. The Soviet retreat had devastated the fuel and water stations and the locomotive exchange points along those few lines. Weak roadbeds collapsed under the weight of the German traffic. Turnaround times at the railheads were very slow, and German train engines were poorly designed to withstand the increasingly extreme cold. We're talking now about late November, December of 1941. So even after the army protested, even after the deportation of Jews to Minsk was stopped, that did not relieve the supply situation for the front at all. You wanted to ask me something? I can't. It's not only a matter of my limited computer capabilities, but I can't blow it up. Can I? Can you make the map larger? No, I can't do that. So military considerations also were respected in another instance, often cited as proof that murder had priority over the war effort, namely the massive deportations from Hungary between May and July 1944. The whole undertaking rested on a war-related justification, the need to obtain at least 100,000 Jewish slave laborers in order to make a reality of the fighter staff program, which was the fantastical scheme to bury the Reich's principal arms-producing factories underground. Moreover, the deportation trains took a northwesterly route to Auschwitz, you can see by the arrows, through Slovakia precisely in order to keep them away from the supply lines to the front in eastern Galicia, which is in the upper right corner of this. And finally, despite the enormous number of people involved, 437,000 deportees, the allocation of equipment was trivial. 147 trains over 55 days, usually 3, but never more than 6 per day, accounting altogether for 1 to 2% of the daily railroad traffic in Hungary and employing an infinitesimal 1/15 of 1% of the functioning locomotives and 1/10 of 1% of the rolling stock under the jurisdiction of the German Armaments Ministry at the time. The relatively small requirements of the entire operation made no dent whatsoever in the Reich's ability to transfer 2 SS armored divisions from Ukraine to France during the second half of June 1944 while the Hungarian action was in motion. That's a very important sentence. I hope, did I say it slowly enough? While they were doing all of this, they moved 2 full SS armored divisions from the Russian front to meet the invasion at D-Day. And the deportation of the Hungarian Jews made no difference to that at all. Another compelling testament to the priority of the war effort over the killing of Jews is the great decline in the frequency and number of deportation trains after Stalingrad that this table documents. The sharp downturns in 1943 and the continuing drop in 1944 outside of Hungary resulted primarily from the diminishing number of Jews remaining for the Nazis to round up and the growing resistance in Europe to delivering Jews into Nazi hands, as Bulgaria and Romania reneged on promises to hand over their Jewish populations, and Vichy France's cooperativeness also receded. But contributing to the decline was the reversal of Germany's military fortunes, and thus the increasing concentration of rail resources on the Reich's struggle to survive. One can trace the effects in microcosm on the pace of deportations from the Netherlands. This is an image of the memorial at the transit camp at Westerbork, on the eastern side of the Netherlands, which is where most of the Jews from the Netherlands were deported. This is the place from which they were deported. They were brought there first and then loaded on trains. Having departed for Auschwitz every 3 to 4 days, from July to November 1942, the trains now, after that, the trains left now for Sobibor only once every 7 days from March to July 1943. And then from Vught, which was the other transit camp, or Westerbork, back to Auschwitz at widening intervals thereafter. What then is the state of the historical art today regarding Raoul Hilberg's 3 claims mentioned at the beginning of this chapter? First, the deportation of the Jews was not continuous throughout the period 1941-44, but subject to numerous interruptions and a steep decline almost everywhere in Nazi-controlled Europe after 1942. Second, transports did not have priority of access to equipment, except in very unusual circumstances, such as in France in mid-1942, when the German general who for a time commanded the railroad traffic in the country shared the anti-Semitic convictions of his SS counterparts, or when a regime allied with Nazi Germany did, as in Slovakia in 1942 or Hungary in 1944. The Slovaks even provided the needed trains and paid the Germans to receive them. The Hungarians rounded up all the people and put them on the trains. Otherwise, deportations made do with relatively small reserves of frequently dilapidated equipment. Third, lack of transport contributed to the survival of many Jews late in the war, especially in France, though it was not the principal reason why the lucky remnant lived to see the end of the Third Reich. An accurate appreciation of the relative scale of the railroad resources required for murder tells us something important about how and why the National Railroad could play its part effectively, because doing so was not very difficult until after the war turned against Germany. Participation entailed little equipment, much of it unusable or momentarily unused for other purposes, and transformed such equipment into revenue. Even after the tide of battle turned, enough such equipment remained to keep a slowing process going in fits and starts right to the very end of the Third Reich. Thank you all for your attention. I'll be glad to answer questions.
So thank you very much, Professor Hayes. About the question period, it's of course different for people following us on Zoom than here in the room. First of all, most of you with questions here in the room received a card or slip of paper, and if you could pass those this way, we will deal with them. Those of you who are following on Zoom, please put your question into the Q&A. And I'm going to hand out some more cards. If you didn't get one, okay. Okay. Yeah.
I don't want to drink anymore.
Okay, we have plenty of time for questions. I'm going to start, yes, with several questions that we've already received. First of all, Professor Hayes, does your research suggest that the Sonderzüge were barely perceptible to the public because of the scale of normal train traffic?
Well, the public around the death camps knew what was going on. That was because these were mostly located in isolated places, and they would perceive that the traffic had picked up going in and that there were few people coming out. So, my answer has to be localized. In Berlin, a lot depended initially on where the trains left from. The Nazis started out by shipping people from the cargo station out at the very extreme west end of Berlin. And the people being deported were not allowed to use public transport. So they had to walk through the streets, and it's about an 8-kilometer walk. That occurred at the start of the deportations in broad daylight. And the Nazis soon thought better of that because it was obvious what was happening. And they began deporting people. First, they made it so that those marches occurred before dawn. Then they began deporting people to Theresienstadt, which was the ghetto for supposedly older Jews and so forth. They let those people ride on the streetcar, but they had to get to the Lehrter Bahnhof, Anhalter Bahnhof, which was the railroad station in the city from which they departed. They had to get there before rush hour. And so what they tried to do was conceal these obvious operations. In a big city like that, and then particularly as the deportations decline in number in 1943, they are barely perceptible. And then it depends on the area that you're talking about in the occupied countries. But for instance, again, the example of Amsterdam, which is where the Jewish population of the Netherlands was concentrated, they didn't deport people directly to death from Amsterdam. They sent them first to Westerbork, which is in the middle of nowhere, and then they shipped them out like that. So there are these efforts at camouflage, which reduce the perceptibility of this. On the other hand, there are plenty of eyewitness accounts of trains being stopped in main railroad stations to wait for other more important traffic to go by, and civilians see them. And they see people, in many cases, crying out for water because the cars had very little. And so, it's hard to answer this question with a universal yes or no. It varied a lot from the setting. You might see it once, depending on where you were. You might see it never. You might see it 10 times if you lived someplace else.
I think you just anticipated with what you said the next question, which was how strenuously did the German government seek to hide the extermination of Jews from local populations? Well,
they did. You have to remember that they're really awful. These are terrible stories about infliction of pain and humiliation and so forth, but it gets even worse when you realize that in 1939, because the people who had gotten out were disproportionately young and male, by 1939, the remaining Jewish population in Germany is about 60% over the age of 55, and it's about 60% women. And even heartless Nazis watching an old woman walk through the streets carrying a heavy suitcase are going to be affected by this. And so the regime learned to kind of hide that. But they were more determined to hide it from the Germans, and they weren't determined to hide what was happening. Hitler referred, people dispute about what a direct reference was, but between 7 and 9 times during the Second World War, Hitler gave a speech that referred to the annihilation of the Jews. So the general knowledge is there in the background. They just didn't want people to have to see the gory detail right in front of them. Now, in the occupied countries, it's different because in certain places, the Nazis regarded it as something to advertise. We're doing the work that you would like to do to this minority people. This was true in Western Ukraine. It was true in parts of Poland. It was certainly true in Lithuania. And so there's a different management of the issue in different places.
Next question. Why did the three camps you focused on last week stop operation by the end of 1943?
Because they were intended to, the camps initially were all had a local mission, except for Auschwitz-Birkenau. That is, Treblinka was where it was, Sobibor, Belchec, and Chelmno, because they all had a local reservoir of population that they were supposed to liquidate. And when that was done, their mission was done. Auschwitz-Birkenau had the advantage to be the remnant, the thing that would take care of everybody else, because it was closer to the West and to the Balkans than these places, and it was on a junction of rail lines. So it would be after these camps out in the East had taken care of the large remnant Jewish population from the old Russian Empire Pale of Settlement. Their mission was purely local, and then they were done.
Here is a question from our webinar audience. Your data are impressive, but what is the main takeaway, Ray, our misconceptions about the Holocaust?
Well, in this case, I'm giving you a real micro case. But the takeaway is the incommensurability between the havoc that these people wreak and the resources they have to deploy to do it. It's just not hard for a modern state to do this. It's not hard to find the people who will do it because you don't need very many of them. Remember, Treblinka, 900, maybe 900,000 people were gassed at Treblinka. Might be 100,000 fewer, but yeah. 150 people is the whole garrison. 150 people can wipe out 900,000. Look at the ratio. That's what this is about. It's just to remind us of the enormous power of the modern state. And then also that perspective, that optic issue that I said to you. We have to realize that this occurred within a massive deployment of resources, and the capacity and the numbers of cars. And if you want to take, I'm sorry to have given you that barrage of numbers, but beneath all those numbers is just this sort of sense is, look what the capacities of the modern of that country were. 1 million freight cars. If you remember one number, remember 1 million freight cars, and 25,000 of them get used to deport people. That's what I think the takeaway from this is, and I subjected you to it partly because I want you to see the crazy things historians will do to try to figure things out. And it was no fun to count all this up, and so, but this is, and the remarkable thing is, here we are 60 years later, and we're just figuring this out. We're just tabulating all those deportations and so forth. So when somebody tells you that history doesn't change, bunk, right? You're always finding that picture of Sobibor that I showed you last time and this time, that was found I think I mentioned it last, found in the attic of the family descended from the vice commandant of Sobibor, who was the first one killed in the uprising in the fall of 1943. But they had kept that stuff up in the attic all these years, and around 2018, they opened up the trunk and they found the only surviving pictures of Sobibor. So it's also a story a little bit about how we are relentless historians, and we add over time to what we know, and we look at the available data differently, and we see different things.
By the way, I'm filtering out some questions with current relevance, and I think most of the questions coming in actually are germane. Of course, we are all free to draw whatever conclusions we wish to about the present, but this is not going to be the forum to publicly discuss those questions. I am not going to spare you, however, a hypothetical question,
Okay.
which you can decline to answer. Had Germany not invaded eastward, would Nazi anti-Semitism still have led to extermination of the Jews?
This is sort of, I want to say something, you know, if the moon were made out of green cheese, you know, there is no, the two central principles of Nazism were race and space. And they were fundamentally, so everything was, in a sense, programmed for Stalingrad and Auschwitz. These were the two central objectives of Hitler from the early 1920s. And he didn't quite, he knew by 1926, because he wrote it up in a book that was never published, but it was found in the archives after the war. He knew that he had to, Germany could not become a major power unless it conquered a large, contiguous empire. The model was the way Russia had expanded and the way we had expanded from the East Coast across. Okay. And he referred, he basically analogized Germany's status to the way America had evolved in the 19th century. Another time he referred to Ukraine and Soviet territory as our India. So these were so that's the one vision. The vision is you can't be a major power in the modern world unless you are big and you are self-sufficient. And the only way to get that is Poland, Ukraine, the resources of the Caucasus, the oil, all of that. The other thing is, though, that he believed that Germany cannot triumph unless it removes the subversive Jews from within it. So these are the two things he posits. Now, he doesn't quite know in the 1920s what removal means. The words he uses in German are the very first statement, 1919, he uses two words in German, Beseitigung and Entfernung. Now, Beseitigung literally means German is a Lego language. It's like, you know, we build words out of Latin roots, and okay, German does that, only the roots are different and the prefixes and the suffixes different. Beseitigung literally means besiding. Beseit, side, is ing. Entfernung literally means outfaring, usually translated as removal. So these are words that you use about displacing objects. It has been incorrectly translated over the years as elimination, but elimination in English goes one step further. It implies erasure, sometimes, not always. But Entfernung and Beseitigung do not. And so he took time to figure this out, and people disagree in trying to know what is the moment at which he tips toward murder. He does not appear to do it until at the earliest 1938, 39, that moment where he begins to use the word Vernichtung, annihilation, which he does in a speech to the Reichstag on the 30th of January, 1939. The whole SS apparatus in 1938 had increasingly understood that expansion and purity were working at cross purposes, because every time you expanded, you got as many Jews as you had driven out in the preceding years. So the moment when they take Austria and the Sudetenland and the Protectorate, what today's Czech Republic, and they get almost as many Jews as had fled Germany already, is the moment where they suddenly say, the math isn't working. And then they go, it's very clear, they go to a policy of forced deportation. They begin to bring all the Jews in Germany, not into ghettos, but into separate houses where they all have to live. And then in Poland, they bring them all into ghettos, and the ghettos are located on railroad lines, in big towns on railroad lines for the most part. And the idea is, when we win the war, we can put them anywhere we want. And they have a series of dreams about where they want to go. The island of Madagascar, which had been an anti-Semitic dream since the 1880s in Europe. But for that, they needed a treaty with France, and they didn't get it. And then they also needed to be able to put people on boats or in planes and send them to Madagascar. And they lost the Battle of Britain and they couldn't do that. So then they begin to think about the East. And you get, they tried actually to persuade Stalin to take the Jews from the German part of occupied Poland, and he wouldn't do it. And then they dreamed of, well, after we beat the Soviets, we can put them up beyond the Arctic Circle or out in Siberia. And so all of this doesn't seem to crystallize around murder until first they go to deportation, which is going to involve a lot of death. And then in 1941, as they're moving into Russia, they say, you know, we don't want all the problems of having the ghettos that we've had here in Poland and so forth. Why not just shoot them? And they do that to the people who are in the line of fire. And they start doing that in July of 41. And by September, October, they're saying, well, you know, the Gauleiter, the Nazi leaders, regional leaders back here are talking about they want to free up housing in the Reich for the people who've been bombed. The people in occupied Poland, the administrators say, you know, managing the ghettos is really difficult, and there are too many people in them, and they spread disease. Can't we clean them out? And this leads to the idea of planting Chelmno where it goes and Belchich where it goes. That's how it starts. So there's a sliding into this, but it's the logical conclusion of the two trends that they are seeking. Because if you're going to get the space is going to present you with the race issue because of the population. And what are you going to do? And so this is how it unfolds. So and punchline to that, there's no way they wouldn't have expanded into the East. That's the whole purpose of the system. And so it's going to lead to this kind of an outcome.
I liked your comparison with what if the moon were made of green cheese?
Right, right.
And there was, as you've made very clear, there was some inevitability about the move westward, eastward.
Now, if Hitler had, you know, in early November 1939, there was an assassination attempt on Hitler. He went back to the annual celebration at the Bürgerbräukeller in Munich, which is where he first had launched the beer hall putsch in 1923. And they used to have an annual party, and he would give a speech to the loyalists and so on. And he left early that night. Something about he couldn't fly. There was an airline problem. He decided he had to take a train. Even the Chancellor of Germany had to take the last train from Munich to Berlin that night. He left. He went to the railroad station. The pillar in the beer hall, right behind where he stood, blew up 15 minutes later. And that was an assassination attempt by a single German, a man named Georg Elser, who tried to kill him. And if that had succeeded, that's the question of would there have been a Holocaust? Because though he was surrounded by Himmler and Goebbels were rabid anti-Semites, but Goering was the number 2 guy, and Goering, you know, was more interested in collecting art and various other things and might not have pushed this to its logical conclusion. That's a different hypothetical.
I'll try to spare you hypothetical questions going forward. Here's a question from a Northwestern colleague, Anne Landau, from the French department, now retired. As you know, she writes, Serge Klarsfeld found many of the documents that the French said they did not have. In his memorial to the Jews deported from France, Klarsfeld lists 77 convoys with the names of deportees, not 73 as Yad Vashem claims. Did you find this discrepancy?
I did, and I asked Yad Vashem about it, and they say that there are 2 duplicate entries in the list. And so that the number is 73 is the accurate number, but I did ask them. I also asked you know, in the main camp at Auschwitz now, some of the barracks, which they were made out of stone, they were made out of brick, so they survived. Many of those have been converted into national exhibits. about the deportations and the people who came from each country and ended up there. The French pavilion lists 73. And so I already had noticed that discrepancy, and that's why I asked. But the people at Yad Vashem are pretty sure that that two of the entries there are duplicates.
Mhm. Also, she asks, who was the German general in France you were referring to?
I'd have to look it up in the footnotes.
Okay.
I don't remember, but there was I do remember the name of the SS man he talked to, which was Dannecker, but I don't remember the name of the German general. I'll look you up, Ann, and I'll send.
Okay. I'm sure she says thank you.
Okay.
Can you comment on the claims that IBM provided and supported the data management tools to track the deportations and coordinate the necessary resources?
IBM had almost nothing to do with the Holocaust. Edwin Black's book and is a tissue of fabrications. The claim of Edwin Black's book is that IBM's tabulation of census data was used to locate Jews in various places and round them up, and then was used to compile deportation lists. Now, we know the second fact is not true, because until very recently, there were people still alive who compiled those lists. They were people who were in the Hungarian Jewish community. They were people in the headquarters of the Reichsvereinigung der Deutschen Juden in Berlin, in the Große Hamburger Straße. What happened was the Gestapo would basically say to whatever the local council of Jews was. This was also in Amsterdam. This is very well documented. Basically say, we're going to have a train on this date. We want X thousand people to go on that train. Pick them. And in Amsterdam, it was the Jewish community leaders who picked them. In Berlin, they didn't say pick them name by name. They said the people should fit the following description: male, female, age group, whatever. Pull out of your files, because they all had questionnaires that everybody who was in the community living in Berlin had to fill out. Pull out of your files the number of people who meet the description we have set and send us those questionnaires. So that went to the Gestapo, and the Gestapo then went through the list and typed up a list and sent it back to the Jewish Community Center and said, notify them. So the Jewish Community Center sent out postcards. And this is, you hear these heart-wrenching stories. I had a good friend who has died now, but his grandmother was from Breslau, which is now Wrocław in Poland. And all they know is the night she died. And they think that she got the postcard that afternoon. And so she put her head in the oven and gassed herself to death. And there were massive suicides, because that card would arrive from the local, and they tell you, you have 2 days, be there at 6 a.m, such and such a place, and you go. And so there were thousands of suicides that occurred. And but this was not done with elaborate tabulations. The Gestapo didn't rely on the census reports because they thought they're out of date. The census was taken in 1939. The major deportations begin from Berlin in the fall of 1941. People have been moved out of their apartments into these so-called Jew houses in between. The most up-to-date records were the ones of the Jewish community itself. Now, earlier, so we know these people survived, and they told us how it happened, and there's no involvement of IBM in any of this. And when you get to the Warsaw Ghetto, where, 56 days, they deport almost 300,000 people. And that's simply that they basically tell the head of the Jewish council, we need 6,000 people at this railroad spot. So it's called the Danziger Bahnhof on the northern edge of the ghetto. Assemble them there. And the Jewish police had to go find them and round them up. And so this was not done with IBM machinery at all. Now, back in Germany, it's also true that they didn't use the IBM records to find where people lived because the German tax records were done. You don't have a centralized IRS office in Germany. What you have is a local Finanzamt. And everybody in the district where you live is registered in that financial office. And that is the most up-to-date records of where people lived. So when they're concentrating the Jews in the Jew houses, that's the records they're using to find them. So he's assembled this story about IBM, but as far as I can tell, the only thing that IBM had to do with the German murder operation was that IBM machines did have some role in the scheduling of trains. I don't know how it worked, but because, it's very hard to, the punch cards would know where all the equipment is. You have a punch card for every wagon. It's a way of identifying, and that keeps track of whether the wagon is in this station or that station. I don't know how the punch cards were used to schedule trains, which is part of what Black claims. But the IBM machines had nothing to do with rounding up people. The most striking claim that Black makes, which I just think is breathtaking, is that the IBM had a role in the compiling the Romanian census in the spring of 1941, and that this was indispensable to killing the Jews of Romania. But in the spring of 1941, the two provinces of Romania, where most of the Jewish population were under Soviet occupation. They were not counted in the census. The invasion of the Soviet Union comes at the end of June 1941, and the Romanian army rolls in. And they operate pretty much the way the Einsatzgruppen operated. They ask people to assemble, and then they ask the locals who aren't Jewish to point out anybody who didn't, and then they shoot them.
Question from the webinar audience. I appreciate your data, and Hilberg's claims do appear overly dramatic. But I'm uneasy about—
I knew there was a but coming.
I am uneasy about your own overall point. To emphasize that more energy went into the war effort than into the Jew killing effort risks giving the impression that Jew killing wasn't a chief focus. What about the counterpoint that killing Jews cheaply and inefficiently actually reflects grisly determination?
I think both things are true. I mean, they were absolutely determined to kill the Jews. It was ideologically central. Okay, they believed they couldn't win the war without killing the Jews. That said, it was practically peripheral because you could do it with so little in the way of resources. So both things are true. It's ideologically central. These people must die. And this is where I differ with a lot of my colleagues in the field. I think the Holocaust is about Jews. It's not about gay men. It's not about the handicapped in the institutions, because there were other reasons to go after those people, not the same ideological reason. And again, and the same is true with regard to gypsies, about whom Sinti and Roma, about whom the Nazis are very inconsistent. They kill all of the Sinti and Roma in Latvia, and they kill almost none of the Sinti and Roma in Lithuania. Go figure. They draw a distinction between Muslim and Christian Sinti and Roma there. And there are plenty of non-Nazi regimes in the world that go after these other groups. Gay people are persecuted to this day in many parts of the globe, where it's go to Uganda, right? And the same thing with people who advocate euthanasia and not keeping expensive but handicapped people alive and so on. These all had independent roots to those results. The Nazis were obsessed with Jews, and every last one had to die. Even Jews who said, "I'm not a Jew. I've been baptized. My parents were baptized," so on. They all had to die. Whereas in these other groups, there are always some exceptions. I went through the numbers about gay men last time, so the number who are actually killed is a tiny, tiny share of the population. So I think both things can be true. It's just very hard to hold these things in your head at the same time because I used the word before, incommensurability. It's just very hard to think of the enormous pain and suffering and mortality rate, and then that it was not materially essential. We all want to believe that it must have done some harm to the German war effort. We want to believe it boomeranged, but it didn't.
You mentioned earlier that the quantification of deportations and of deaths is becoming more and more precise as research proceeds. How are we feeling today? How are you feeling today about the figure of 6 million Jews killed?
It's amazing how well it has held up. There were people who, Victor Klemperer is a German. Victor Klemperer was a professor of French literature at the university in Dresden. His parents were converts, and he had been baptized, I think, at birth. He was married to a non-Jewish woman. She would not divorce him, and so for that reason, he was able to live out the Third Reich. He barely survived. One of the only silver linings of the bombing of the city of Dresden in February of 1945 is that he was about to be deported because the exceptions for people married to non-Jews and all of that were eliminated in January 45. But he was going to be sent to Theresienstadt. And then the bombing came, and the city was, of course, in complete confusion. And he was able to rip off the Jewish star, and he and his wife walked for several miles, and then they got a train, and they ended up in Bavaria somewhere. So he survived. He left a diary. And the 2 volumes that cover the Nazi period have been published in English. He knew that between 5 and 6 million Jews had been killed. He wrote this in 1945. There's a speech by the commander of the Jewish brigade in the British Army in 1945 to his men, in which he talks about 6 million being killed. The number was there. And we have done all kinds of recalculations over the years. The number of people in the occupied Soviet Union who were killed has risen steadily from the earlier estimates, which were based on very bad census data. Some of the other numbers have fallen. I mentioned, I think last time, that the number of people killed at Majdanek has dropped down steadily, where some of the others have risen. But the 6 million is pretty much there. You get some, Hilberg was very cautious. He said 5.1 million, I think. I've calculated, from the best I can put it all together, is about 5.9. Some people say a little more than 6, but it's held up pretty well.
Another kind of basic question. When did the use of the word Holocaust become common?
In the 50s. Raoul never used it or didn't like it. And his big book is called The Destruction of the European Jews. He used destruction because the Hebrew word shoah can be translated as destruction. The first big book about the subject was Gerald Reitlinger, which is called The Final Solution in the 1950s. The term became more and more popular as time went on, and it was chosen, I think, or because there was an attempt, there was a desire to specify that this was different from other instances of mass murder, and that therefore a particular term of art was required, and it has become the term of art, and so it has such momentum that there's no arguing about it anymore.
We have time for one more question. And this is a very broad question that we may not have time to deal with, and you may also not want to address it. What is the most important takeaway from your conclusions in your own mind? And would you care to say anything about current relevance? I know we weren't going to get into that. But,
well, I think I mentioned last time that somebody asked me about Dan Stone's book, and I replied I thought the best thing that Dan says in that book, which is so simple, but it hits you right between the eyes, is the Holocaust is this demonstration of the capacity of people to believe in lunatic things and then to carry them to their logical conclusion. And that, I think, is very terrifying. I also didn't say last time, the German language has wonderful words because all this plasticity. One of the best words in the German language is Treppenwitz, 3 syllables. What does it mean? It means the thing you realize walking out of a meeting when you're on the stairway that you should have said. Okay. French has this too. It's called esprit d'escalier in French, but in Treppenwitz, this is and I realized I should have said something last time about, because because people ask me about my biography, how I got here and so on. And I'm a non-Jew who has been fixated on this subject for such a long time. Why? And I realized that it's something left of my Catholic upbringing. There's not much left of my Catholicism, but what is left is this a kind of secularized version of concern for somebody's immortal soul, because this is not a subject that is only about Jews. This is a subject about the people who do it. This is, and that my takeaway is to constantly look at the people who do it. And though I don't talk about the after effects on that society of what it did, I have lived with it. And ever since the first time I went to Germany in Christmas of 1968. So this is a subject that what I am most concerned to do is not to reach Jews who know what the subject is all about. My concern is to reach the people who could have perpetrated it, the non-Jews. And so that's my takeaway. That's why I do this. And that's maybe why my particular angle of vision on this is a little different. How easy it was for them to do it, how corrupted they were. My next book, which is going to come out, I think, in December or January, is about German industry and the leaders of the big corporations and so forth, and the way in which they are corrupted by the temptations that this regime offers. And they're very structured temptations. They are, because the economy is so controlled in so many ways that they can construct the choices of these leaders so that in the usual way that corporate executives think, rational calculation and so forth, their rational decisions become ones that serve the ideology of the state. And again, my focus is on the doers, the perpetrators, the side that, and I want to lay this bare in the futile hope that it will make people better.
Professor Peter Hayes, thank you so much.